The Galactic Maritime Research Consortium had always prided itself on being the premier authority on aquatic civilizations across 17 star systems. Their underwater facility on Kepler-42b represented the pinnacle of xenobiological research, a gleaming testament to advanced engineering that could withstand the crushing depths of an alien ocean, while housing the galaxy's most brilliant minds. Of course, none of these brilliant minds had bothered to consider that studying humans might require more than academic arrogance and a waterproof laboratory. The research station hung suspended 3 kilometers beneath the surface of Kepler-42b's endless ocean, its bioluminescent hull pulsing with the same rhythm as the native jellyfish outside. Inside, the Zephyrian research team moved through corridors filled with holographic displays showing diving patterns, pressure tolerances, and respiratory data of various species. The lead researcher, a tall creature whose translucent skin revealed the slow pulse of green blood beneath, gestured enthusiastically at a wall of monitors displaying human diving statistics. Their excitement was understandable, if misguided. Humans had recently established a small experimental colony on the ocean floor, and their primitive yet supremely effective diving techniques had caught the attention of species who considered themselves infinitely more evolved. The Zephyrians, who could naturally survive in pressurized environments thanks to their specialized physiology, found human adaptability both fascinating and amusing. After all, how sophisticated could a species be if they needed mechanical assistance just to breathe underwater? The opportunity presented itself during a routine maintenance operation on the human colony's thermal generators. The human engineer had been working alone, as her species often did with their characteristic stubborn independence, when the research team's capture nets deployed around her. The irony was delicious. A species that had mastered interstellar travel, reduced to using fishing nets to catch their subjects. But then again, the consortium had always believed in using the appropriate tool for the appropriate level of civilization. The engineer's capture had been embarrassingly easy. One moment she was recalibrating pressure valves on the ocean floor, the next she was being hauled through the water toward the research station like some exotic deep-sea specimen. Her environmental suit registered the change in pressure as they ascended to the station's docking bay, but she remained remarkably calm throughout the process. This should have been the first warning sign, but the research team was too busy congratulating themselves on acquiring such a perfect test subject. Once aboard, the engineer was processed with the same clinical efficiency the consortium applied to all their specimens. Her diving equipment was confiscated and catalogued, her vital signs recorded, and her psychological profile analyzed through a series of non-invasive scans that revealed exactly what the researchers expected: a relatively simple neural pattern typical of a species still dependent on external technology for survival. The research team gathered in their primary observation chamber to discuss their approach. The facility's chief psychologist, whose forearms gestured in precise patterns while speaking, outlined their strategy with the confidence of someone who had broken countless subjects from dozens of species. The human would be subjected to controlled environmental stressors, sensory manipulation, and cognitive disruption techniques that had proven effective across the galaxy. After all, the psychological principles that governed sentient behavior were universal constants, or so they believed. Their hubris was breathtaking in its completeness. The team discussed the humans' probable breaking points with the same detached professionalism they might use to analyze a particularly interesting species of deep-sea mollusk. Humans, they concluded, were emotionally unstable creatures who relied heavily on social bonds and environmental familiarity. Remove these supports, apply the appropriate pressure, and any human would eventually comply with their research objective. The interrogation chamber had been prepared with meticulous attention to detail. Variable lighting systems could simulate everything from the harsh glare of surface sunlight to the absolute darkness of the deep ocean. Atmospheric controls could adjust pressure, temperature, and gas composition to create any environment imaginable. Sonic generators could produce frequencies designed to induce anxiety, confusion, or despair in most known species. It was, by any measure, a masterpiece of psychological warfare. The engineer was brought to the chamber still wearing her diving suit, though her helmet had been removed to allow for better monitoring of her facial expressions and stress responses. She looked around the sophisticated interrogation setup with what appeared to be professional curiosity rather than fear. This too should have been a warning sign. As the research team prepared to begin their systematic breaking of another primitive subject, They failed to notice the engineer's eyes cataloging every structural detail of their precious submarine. They missed the way she tested the flexibility of her restraints with the casual efficiency of someone accustomed to working in confined spaces. Most critically, they overlooked the slight smile that crossed her face when she realized just how many critical design flaws their advanced facility actually contained. The consortium was about to learn that sometimes the most dangerous thing about studying humans is discovering that they might be studying you right back. Part 2. The Breaking Attempt. The interrogation began at what the Zephyrians considered an optimal psychological moment, immediately after the subject had been given enough time to contemplate her situation, but before adaptive responses could fully develop. It was a timing perfected across millennia of breaking lesser species, and the research team approached their task with the methodical precision of surgeons preparing to dissect a particularly interesting specimen. The chief psychologist initiated the first phase by gradually reducing the chamber's lighting until the engineer sat in near total darkness. This technique had proven devastatingly effective on most species. Beings evolved under natural sunlight cycles typically experienced profound disorientation when deprived of visual reference point. The monitoring equipment registered the expected physiological responses. Slightly elevated heart rate increased neural activity in the visual cortex, as her brain attempted to process the absence of light. What the monitors failed to capture was the quiet satisfaction in the engineer's voice when she spoke into the darkness. Interesting approach, though I have to point out that your illumination system is drawing about 30% more power than necessary. Inefficient LED arrays, probably using deprecated quantum phosphors, must be expensive to maintain down here. The research team exchanged glances that conveyed millennia of academic superiority tinged with the first whisper of uncertainty. Subjects weren't supposed to provide technical critiques during psychological torture. They were supposed to break. Phase 2 involved atmospheric manipulation, a gradual increase in pressure designed to simulate the crushing depths that most surface-dwelling species found terrifying. The engineer's breathing remained steady as the chamber's atmosphere thickened around her, though she did shift slightly in her restraints. Finally, a reaction. "You know," she said conversationally, as if discussing the weather rather than experiencing what should have been paralyzing claustrophobia. "This pressure differential is putting some interesting stress on your bulkhead joint. I can actually hear the micro-fractures developing in the hull plating. Might want to have your maintenance team look at that." The four-armed psychologist's appendages began moving in increasingly agitated pattern. According to their extensive databases, humans were particularly vulnerable to environmental pressures that reminded them of their own mortality. Yet this specimen seemed more concerned about their facility's structural integrity than her own survival. Phase 3 escalated to sonic manipulation. Frequencies calibrated to induce anxiety, panic, and eventually complete psychological collapse. The subsonic waves thrummed through the chamber with scientific precision, targeting the neural pathways that controlled fear responses in most known species. The engineer's biometric readings showed the expected stress indicators, but her verbal responses continued to defy every psychological model in their archives. "Oh, that's clever," she said, raising her voice slightly to compensate for the sound waves. "Resonance frequency target. Though you might want to check your calculations. You're hitting the harmonic frequency of your own support struts. Keep this up and you'll vibrate your own infrastructure apart before you break me." The lead researcher, whose translucent skin had shifted from calm green to an agitated orange, consulted with his team through rapid pheromone exchanges that their primitive subject couldn't possibly understand. Their confusion was palpable. Every technique that had successfully broken subjects from 17 different star systems was being treated like a casual engineering consultation. Phase 4 introduced temperature extremes, rapid fluctuations between freezing and scorching, that should have triggered panic responses in any rational being. The engineer endured the thermal assault with the same professional detachment she might show when testing equipment tolerances, occasionally commenting on the energy inefficiency of their heating elements or the poor thermal distribution in their chamber design. It was during Phase 5, complete sensory deprivation combined with disorienting magnetic field manipulation, that the research team made their first critical error. Frustrated by their subjects' persistent analytical commentary, they decided to move beyond standard psychological techniques into more direct neural intervention. The facility's medical officer, a spindly creature whose specialized appendages could interface directly with most species' nervous systems, was brought in to perform what they euphemistically called cognitive adjustment. The engineer watched with interest as the medical equipment was wheeled into the chamber. Fascinating setup you have here. Direct neural interface technology. Must be at least third-generation quantum entanglement process. Though I notice you're using isolated power coupling for the interface array. Smart thinking given what I assume are the catastrophic feedback potentials. If someone with the right knowledge decided to overload your system. The medical officer paused, its delicate interface appendages hovering inches from the engineer's temple. Something in her tone suggested knowledge that went far beyond what their psychological profiles had indicated. But they had come too far to stop now. And besides, what could one primitive human possibly know about advanced Zephyrian neurotechnology? As the neural interface made contact, the engineer's smile widened just slightly. The monitoring equipment registered a sudden spike in her brain activity, not the confused scrambling of a mind being invaded, but the focused intensity of someone solving a particularly complex technical problem in real time. Interesting, she murmured, as the alien technology attempted to map her neural pathways. Your interface protocol assumes a standard synaptic response pattern, but human brains are wonderfully chaotic systems. Lots of redundant pathways and adaptive plasticity makes us quite difficult to predict. The medical officer's confidence began to waver as its sophisticated equipment encountered neural patterns that defied every xenobiological model in their database. Instead of the expected cognitive breakdown, the human's mind seemed to be actively analyzing and adapting to their intrusion. Worse, the feedback through the neural interface suggested she was beginning to understand their technology at a fundamental level. The final phase of their interrogation protocol involved psychological manipulation, based on species-specific fears and cultural vulnerabilities. For humans, this typically meant isolation from social groups, threats to survival, and reminders of their technological dependence. The chief psychologist, prepared to deliver what should have been the crushing blow to their subjects' resistance. Instead, the engineer looked directly at the observation window where the research team watched in growing bewilderment. You know what the really interesting thing is about all this? You've shown me every major system in your facility, power distribution, structural support, atmospheric controls, even your neural interface technology. It's like getting a complete technical manual, but with the added bonus of hands-on testing. Her smile had evolved from professional interest to something that made the research team profoundly uncomfortable. So here's my question. Did you really think you were breaking me, or was I learning how to break you? Part 3, the counter-engineering. The shift in dynamics was so subtle that the Zephyrian research team almost missed it entirely. What they perceived as a breakthrough in their interrogation protocol was actually the moment their prisoner decided to stop playing defense and start conducting her own experiment. The engineer's apparent psychological collapse, complete with trembling hands and a suddenly cooperative demeanor, was perhaps the most convincing performance of her career. "Please," she whispered, her voice carrying just the right note of defeated exhaustion. "I can't take any more of this. What do you want to know?" The research team's collective smugness was almost palpable. Finally, their superior techniques had achieved the expected result. The chief psychologist's translucent skin shifted to a satisfied shade of deep blue as he consulted his notes, preparing to extract whatever primitive secrets this species might possess about underwater survival. What followed was a masterclass in psychological manipulation, disguised as capitulation. The engineer began sharing technical details about human diving procedures with the enthusiastic cooperation of someone whose spirit had been thoroughly broken. She described pressure adaptation techniques, emergency ascent protocols, and the intricate engineering behind human life support systems. The research team recorded every word, convinced they were documenting the conquest of another inferior species. The beauty of her approach lay in its apparent transparency. Every piece of information she provided was technically accurate, just selectively incomplete in ways that served her purpose. When she explained human pressure suit technology, she helpfully pointed out several design improvements that could be applied to Zephyrian equipment. When she described thermal regulation systems, she suggested modifications that would make their facility more efficient. Her captors interpreted this as the desperate attempt of a broken mind to curry favor through usefulness. The reality was considerably more elegant. Each suggestion contained carefully embedded flaws that would create cascading system failures if implemented. Her recommendations for improved power distribution would overload their primary conduits. Her atmospheric efficiency upgrades would gradually compromise their air recycling system. Her structural reinforcement proposals would actually weaken critical support joints through harmonic resonance effects. The medical officer, still nursing wounded pride from the neural interface debacle, was particularly receptive to her insights about human physiology. The engineer explained, with touching gratitude for their merciful treatment, how human neural patterns could be more effectively monitored using modified Zephyrian technology. Her suggestions for interface improvements were implemented immediately, creating backdoor access points that would later prove catastrophically useful. "Your species is remarkably adaptable," she told the research team with admiring sincerity. "The way you've integrated biomechanical systems throughout this facility is genuinely impressive, though I notice some potential optimization opportunities in your structural load distribution network." The engineering team assigned to oversee facility maintenance found her observations fascinating. Here was a primitive being who nonetheless demonstrated intuitive understanding of advanced construction principles. When she suggested that their primary support struts could be lightened by introducing strategic perforations at specific stress points, they implemented the changes with academic enthusiasm. After all, reducing structural mass would improve their facility's buoyancy characteristics. The fact that these perforations were precisely calculated to create fault propagation pathways throughout their hull was naturally not mentioned in her recommendation. Her cooperation extended to participating in additional research protocols, with an eagerness that the team found both gratifying and slightly disturbing. She volunteered for stress testing procedures, offered herself as a subject for environmental adaptation studies, and even suggested improvements to their experimental methodologies. Each session provided her with additional access to critical systems under the guise of research participation. The facility's computer networks proved particularly vulnerable to her helpful nature when she demonstrated human problem-solving techniques. By working through complex engineering calculations, she naturally required access to their computational resource. Her work sessions, monitored but not truly understood by her captors, allowed her to map their entire digital infrastructure, while appearing to struggle with basic mathematical concepts. "I'm sorry I'm so slow with these calculations," she apologized after spending hours interfacing with their quantum processing arrays. "Human brains aren't really designed for this level of complexity. But I think I'm starting to understand how your systems integrate with each other." Understanding was an understatement. She had identified every critical pathway, every backup system, and every potential failure point in their elaborate technological ecosystem. More importantly, she had begun planting logic bombs in their code, subtle alterations that would activate simultaneously to create systematic breakdowns across multiple operational areas. The research team's growing confidence in their success was evident in their increasingly casual treatment of their prize subject. Security protocols were relaxed as she demonstrated complete compliance with their research objective. Her restraints were removed during work sessions, and she was even permitted to move freely within secured areas of the facility. After all, where could she possibly go in the middle of an alien ocean? This newfound freedom allowed her to conduct direct inspections of critical systems under the pretext of helping with maintenance procedure. Her eager assistance with routine engineering tasks was interpreted as the desperate gratitude of a thoroughly broken spirit seeking to prove its usefulness. She calibrated sensors, adjusted environmental controls, and performed diagnostics on life support systems with the meticulous attention to detail that had made her valuable to the human colony. Each task provided opportunities for subtle sabotage disguised as helpful optimization. Pressure relief valves were adjusted to fail-safe positions that would actually create dangerous overpressure conditions. Emergency systems were modified to respond more efficiently by shutting down rather than activating during crisis situations. Structural monitoring sensors were recalibrated to provide readings that were accurate right up until the moment catastrophic failure became inevitable.
The chief psychologist documented their success with academic pride, noting how completely their subjects' resistance had been eliminated. Their reports to the Galactic Maritime Research Consortium would become landmark studies in the psychological manipulation of primitive species. The human had been transformed from a defiant prisoner into an enthusiastic collaborator, eager to share the secrets of her species' modest technological achievement. As the research team prepared to begin the final phase of their study, a comprehensive analysis of human diving capabilities under extreme stress conditions, none of them noticed the engineer's quiet satisfaction as she reviewed the facility's structural blueprints one last time. The countdown to systematic failure had begun, initiated by dozens of carefully planted vulnerabilities that would activate in perfect synchronization. The irony was exquisite. In their determination to break one human, they had given her everything she needed to break them. Part 4: The Structural Failure. The cascade began at precisely 14:47 station time, triggered not by any dramatic action, but by the simple passage of time, reaching the engineer's carefully calculated threshold. The first sign of trouble was a barely perceptible vibration in the facility's primary support structure, a harmonic resonance that the Zephyrian monitoring systems initially dismissed as routine operational variant. After all, their sensors had been recently recalibrated by their helpful human consultant, and the readings fell well within acceptable parameters. The chief psychologist was in the middle of dictating his final research notes when the facility's atmospheric processors began their death spiral. The efficiency improvements suggested by their cooperative subject had indeed optimized the system's performance, right up until the moment they triggered a cascading feedback loop that turned their air recycling network into an elaborate method of atmospheric poisoning. Fascinating behavioral adaptation patterns, he was saying to his recording device, oblivious to the steadily rising concentration of industrial compounds in the air around him. Subject demonstrates complete psychological integration with research objectives, suggesting total dominance establishment over primitive neural architecture. 3 levels below, the engineer sat in her assigned quarters, calmly reviewing structural engineering principles, while listening to the increasingly urgent sounds of emergency alerts echoing through the facility's corridors. The symphony of systematic failure was unfolding exactly as she had orchestrated, each component breakdown triggering the next in a carefully choreographed sequence of technological collapse. The power distribution network was the second system to fail, though its demise was considerably more dramatic than the atmospheric problems. The load balancing improvements she had suggested worked flawlessly until the moment they didn't, at which point the facility's entire electrical grid experienced what could charitably be described as an energetic disagreement with the laws of physics. Emergency lighting flickered on just long enough to illuminate the growing panic on alien faces before those systems, too, succumbed to the cascade. The research team's first indication that their success story might have been slightly premature came when the facility's main structural supports began exhibiting behavior that defied their understanding of material science. The strategic perforations they had so eagerly implemented were propagating microfractures throughout the hull at an exponential rate, turning their advanced facility into an elaborate demonstration of catastrophic failure theory. "This is impossible," the lead engineer announced to nobody in particular as he watched his instruments register stress readings that shouldn't have been survivable. These modifications were designed to improve structural efficiency. They had improved efficiency in exactly the way the human had intended. The facility was now very efficiently converting itself from a research station into a collection of high-pressure debris scattered across the ocean floor. The medical officer, whose sophisticated neural interface equipment had been experiencing increasingly erratic behavior, finally understood the magnitude of their miscalculation when every piece of technology in his laboratories simultaneously achieved critical failure. The helpful modifications to their monitoring systems had indeed made them more responsive, so responsive that they were now responding to threats that didn't exist, while ignoring the very real catastrophe developing around them. "The human," he said, his voice carrying the kind of dawning horror typically reserved for species, discovering they weren't as intelligent as they had assumed. "She's been sabotaging us from the beginning." The revelation came approximately 3 minutes too late to matter. By that point, the facility's structural integrity had degraded beyond any possibility of recovery, and the crushing weight of 3 kilometers of ocean water was preparing to reclaim the space that arrogant aliens had presumed to occupy. In her quarters, the engineer stood and began the methodical process of sealing herself into the one section of the facility that would survive the impending implosion. She had spent considerable effort identifying this particular compartment during her helpful maintenance tours, a redundant reinforced emergency pod that the Zephyrians had installed as a safety measure, and then promptly forgotten about in their confidence that their superior technology would never fail. The sounds of structural collapse were growing more pronounced now, accompanied by the distinctive groaning that heavy-duty materials make when they surrender to forces they were never designed to resist. The facility's bioluminescent hull flickered erratically as power systems failed throughout the complex, creating a light show that would have been beautiful if it weren't announcing imminent death for most of the research team. The chief psychologist, his academic composure finally cracking under the weight of approaching mortality, managed to reach the engineer's location just as she was securing the emergency pod's pressure seal. His translucent skin had shifted to a pale, terrified yellow that conveyed more information about his emotional state than any verbal communication could have achieved. "You planned this," he accused, though his tone suggested he was still struggling to accept the implications of having been outmaneuvered by someone he had considered intellectually inferior. "I planned to survive," she replied calmly, checking the pod's life support systems with professional thoroughness. Everything else was just applied engineering. The final moments of the Galactic Maritime Research Consortium's premier facility were almost anticlimactic. Decades of advanced technology and accumulated knowledge disappeared beneath the waves, with the kind of efficiency that would have impressed the engineer if she hadn't been the one responsible for arranging it. The implosion created a brief, brilliant compression wave that illuminated the ocean depths before fading into the kind of darkness that suggested certain research projects might have been ill-conceived from the beginning. 12 hours later, the human colony's emergency response team found a single survival pod floating on the surface of Kepler. Inside, they discovered their missing engineer, dry and comfortable, calmly reading technical manuals, while her emergency beacon broadcasted her location to anyone interested in conducting a rescue operation. "Rough day at work?" asked the recovery team leader as they hauled the pod aboard their vessel. "Not particularly," she replied, reviewing her notes from what had been, by any objective measure, a remarkably educational experience. "Though I did learn some interesting things about pressure hull design. Apparently there are some species in the galaxy who still haven't figured out that the ocean always wins in the end." Far below, the wreckage of the research facility settled into the sediment of the ocean floor, joining countless other examples of civilizations that had confused technological sophistication with actual intelligence. The native jellyfish, whose bioluminescent patterns had inspired the facility's original design, resumed their ancient migrations through waters that were once again free of alien presumption.
The Galactic Maritime Research Consortium would eventually receive reports about the loss of their facility and research team. These reports would describe equipment failures, structural defects, and the tragic loss of valuable scientific personnel in the pursuit of knowledge. They would not mention that one human engineer had systematically dismantled their most advanced underwater installation using nothing more than helpful suggestions and a thorough understanding of the principles that separate robust engineering from elaborate fragility. After all, some lessons are too embarrassing to document in official records. The galaxy's most advanced civilizations would simply have to discover for themselves that studying humans might be considerably more dangerous than they had assumed. Assuming, of course, that they were intelligent enough to learn from other species' mistakes, which, given the available evidence, seemed increasingly unlikely.